little bit about Aarki before we get into retargeting. So Aarki started in the mobile space back in 2010, but in 2015 we launched Aarki Encore, our integrated platform for programmatic media buying and creative. Since then, we've actually been working with predominantly top gaming developers, and we've been offering unified optimization of their media and creative buys for a variety of mobile app campaigns. We do user acquisition, cross promotion, and retargeting, which is what we're here to talk about today. So a little bit about Aarki, though, in the numbers. So as I said, since 2015, we are a globally distributed team working across 5 offices. We have been integrated with major exchanges with a global presence, with global coverage with our data centers. We have, we've been collecting a lot of device profiles and user profiles, but more importantly, at Aarki, creative is actually a really important part of our product. So actually, in 2017 alone, we have had over 15,000 versions of creative, unique creative, dynamic creative, creative with different variants as we localize or that react to real-time rules. So that's Aarki. And so I want to talk a little bit about the retargeting portion of our business and how we approach retargeting for particularly our mobile gaming customers. So I guess a quick definition so we're all on the same page. When we're thinking about retargeting at Aarki, basically everything is really mobile app focused for us. So it's all about reactivating users who had been previously active in an app. And whether that's someone who has not opened an app in a while or has uninstalled the app, our retargeting campaigns are focused on reactivating them, generating reopens or reinstalls for that specific user. And really, when we're running retargeting campaigns, we do work on customized goals for each of our customers. But a lot of the KPIs we look at tend to be very similar to what we're looking at on a user acquisition standpoint. However, how we approach retargeting is different. So moving on the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about kind of the 4 pillars of retargeting. So retargeting versus user acquisition, we see 4 key ways in how we differentiate our retargeting efforts from other campaigns. Particularly around, I want to talk about sort of the 4 pillars. First of all, audiences. Really, any retargeting campaign has a required list of users we need to target, but what we find is that not all user lists are equal. One thing that we'll expand upon today is how having a clear set of audience segments rather than just one static retargeting user list is what can drive a campaign to really set a campaign up for success. With retargeting related to audiences, a really key thing that we focus on is increasing match rate. It's directly related. For us to be successful with any campaign, we need to ensure that we're able to reach as many of those potential target users as possible. From a technology perspective, we have tools within our bidder platform to optimize to maximizing our reach for retargeting campaign, leveraging technologies on the exchange side. But also from just sort of a campaign perspective, it means leveraging our supply partnerships and actually our creative a little bit differently than we might for user acquisition. Creative is key for us at Aarki. We offer creative services in addition to programmatic media buying. So creative is actually something that we look at slightly differently for retargeting because we're starting off often with a clear idea of who our target audience is. Our creative can be informed by that. We want to maximize match rate, so that means from a creative perspective, we tend to go a lot broader in creative formats to try and hit every last user on that list. And then finally, models. So for us, we actually see the importance in having our models for retargeting be trained only on retargeting campaigns. While it shares a lot of the same aspects of say, user acquisition, what we find is that our models are very user influenced. And what we have found is that actually the user that's reactivated and let's say spends after a retargeting campaign tends to have a different profile than a typical user acquisition user. So one thing that we do is for retargeting, we automatically train all our retargeting models purely on retargeting campaigns so that we're able to better optimize our buying. So how does it all work together? Well, just very quickly to kind of give you an overview of our process for retargeting, it's really all about training, scaling, and learning. And this is where we can get into how these pillars can really influence success. So starting with audience segments, as I mentioned, ideally for us, we want to start with not just a broad set of, these are all the users that we're looking to reactivate, but if we have the opportunity to segment those users according to different attributes, we can actually use that to train our retargeting models faster. That helps us get to performance faster. The next step really with any retargeting campaign is scaling. As I mentioned, we're very aggressive in our supply and our creative coverage to maximize those match rates. And this is a point at which we start generating learnings. So from a learning perspective, that means that goes back into the model, retraining, but also now we start getting into things like campaign management strategy and creative strategy as part of the learning loop. So thinking about what creatives are performing best for this campaign and iterating on them. One of the reasons we have so many creative versions is really focusing on constantly testing different combinations of copy, imagery, background, sequential messaging, dynamic creative. From a campaign management perspective, monitoring, locations, devices, geos, sometimes finding things like interesting different DMAs or regions of the country might perform better. And then finally, actually, we can't leave out the role of the attribution partner. One important area of learning for us when we get to scale is actually through the postbacks, enabling us to monitor performance, ensure that we are hitting our goals. And I think this is what's also really important is, not only getting rich audience data from the beginning, but we strongly encourage all our partners. We recognize data is something that is your most precious resource, but the more information that we're able to receive, say through attribution postbacks, such as revenue, events, and even non-attributed events, all of that informs the model and actually helps us to be more efficient with the dollars and get us to performance faster. So audiences, I keep talking about all these audience segments and having that be the first pillar. So a little bit about how we like to work with retargeting audience lists. So obviously all lists are not created equal, as I mentioned before. We really like to work with rich audience segments, but even how we receive the data is important. What we find is if you are able to push your audience list directly to us, it's better than working off a static list. Static list means essentially out-of-date lists because those lists will never reflect the real-time users of your app. Having dynamic lists pushed directly to our platform via our own audience API or through a platform like Adjust Audience Builder means that as users enter or leave your retargeting criteria, we target them. We're not wasting impressions on targeting users who might have already reactivated. The other places where we can get more interesting with audiences is actually thinking about segmenting these users and providing a retargeting list that's banded, say, by your user's level of spend. Thinking about interesting user attributes that you can additionally share, last activity, engagement. Providing this information, as I mentioned, we can help that pre-train the model and kickstart the campaign. And then the other thing is that we're lucky enough to work with several partners who share this information. And with this, even on things like retargeting, we can actually work with you to create custom target lists based on intersecting various attributes that might be interesting from a retargeting perspective, and actually track that and and identify sort of a key combination of user attributes that perform best for your retargeting campaign, and really push that in terms of budget and effort, and allowing us to focus on the best performing users. So, audiences, I mentioned, really important, but creative is too. So from a creative perspective, this is where, really put a lot of effort in. From retargeting, obviously I mentioned you want to maximize your match rate. So formats is an easy way to start. We find that running on as many formats as possible, native, interstitial, MRAID, video, rewarded video, native video, here you have an opportunity to be really aggressive. You already know who your target user is. You don't have to spend that time learning who that ideal user is and what creatives they perform with. You want to reach them at every point in time. Messaging, so I mentioned, you have an idea who this user is. You can get really creative, and if it's available, take advantage of things like, their last level reached, to think about highlighting new levels. You can leverage time-based messaging, such as promos, because these users already know the app, and those types of messages can actually be really interesting. As is personalization, actually, that's an area that we've been focusing on a lot this year. And what we've actually found is that on a personalized creatives often has really strong conversion rates and install rates. So with retargeting, you have all this information that you can experiment with on a creative perspective. But it's not just creative messaging. So creative format is actually an area I want to talk a little bit about more on the next slide. So creative format, I keep talking about it as a way to maximize match rate, but it's not just for us, it's not just about maximizing match rate. So here's an example of how creative format really has impact for retargeting that that you might not have, you might not expect, at first glance. So if we take a user acquisition campaign that, let's say that's one that's been a mature campaign. It's a mature campaign. We've identified the ideal creative. We've at this point launched across all the formats, and a similar retargeting campaign. So they have a very similar mix of creatives and weights of creatives. One of the interesting things that we found is that when we're looking at what's driving installs, or in the case of retargeting reinstalls or re-engagements, video is taking a much greater share in retargeting than it would in user acquisition. So it's really worthwhile to experiment with the creative formats as well as the messaging, because it can have a huge impact on the performance of your campaign. And in this case, it's not just the installs or the re-engagement, but when we look at the downstream metrics, such as return on ad spend, in user acquisition, video is stronger in terms of return on ad spend. It's about 15% stronger than other units, but in retargeting, that jumps all the way up to 25% better return on ad spend by leveraging video for retargeting. So these are just some of the ways in which overall we look at retargeting campaigns. But I'd actually like to talk about a few specific examples from our customers, over the past year, where we've actually leveraged these pillars, and talk about how we were actually able to drive success for them, either through audiences, creative, or through hands-on campaign management. So our first case study, segueing from the creative side of the discussion, is I want to talk about the power of creatives here. So what I want to set up here is we're talking about one of our advertiser partners, and this is a campaign we worked on for a legacy app. So it's a legacy app with a large global user base. And what I mean by legacy app is they have a large portfolio of apps. And over the years, they've released several new apps, iterations on existing apps. They have a very deep portfolio of apps. And this app is one that they launched early on, so it's a very large active user base. However, they wanted to increase the active users for this core older title by reactivating previous users. So from a creative perspective, we've worked on games of a similar category before. So in this case, we started out initially with a good idea of what creative types of messaging would work. In this case, very similar actually to user acquisition creative, showcasing game characters, gameplay, boosters. However, since we're dealing with a large user base here, from a creative standpoint, we went ahead and had a very large localization effort. And it seems like a no-brainer that localized creatives would be important. Actually, if you looked at the initial numbers in terms of creative performance, you're looking at a localized creative versus a non-localized creative, the click-through rates there was really not a significant difference. But actually, when we look at other metrics, before localization versus after localization, the CPI nearly halved, and the return on ad spend increased dramatically. So the localization actually was better at converting higher value users. And it wasn't just localizing sort of for your tier 1, tier 2 markets. We had nearly 24 languages. And we chose these 24 languages actually because we had rich audience information from the customer. So everything from Portuguese, Spanish to Malay, Farsi, Thai. And then we were able to track the performance of these creatives, track the performance of localization in the geos, and then additionally identify the best performing geos and actually increase targets for them. And as you can see, installs increase, but not only as the installs increase, we're actually able to continue an upward trajectory on the return on ad spend as well, even though we were growing in volume so significantly. But it's not always about, there's more to running a successful campaign than audiences and creative. So here, this is another advertiser we worked with recently. And while a lot of the heavy lifting is done by our algorithms, our campaign managers are actually very hands-on. This can take a variety of forms. So it's never blacklisting or whitelisting publishers, but it's particularly around focusing on creative tests, challenger champions, looking at geos. So here, this is an example where campaign management and active campaign management really drove performance. This customer launched a new game relatively recently, and this is key here. They launched relatively recently, but they wanted to keep the users who had downloaded and played this game active. So here we're not talking at a legacy app. Here, that means that we did not have a very large, rich segment of audiences to work with. Essentially, we're talking about that very general retargeting list. But that doesn't mean that we can't still run a successful retargeting campaign. It just means that we approached it a little bit differently. So in this case, we started here. As with retargeting, we find it's best to maximize your geos wherever possible. Your user, and ran globally. But this is a case where our campaign managers were analyzing the performance and actually identified from a retargeting perspective which was the best combination of geos. And as they identified the best combination of geos, they would go in and actually modify the targets, allowing us to shift our spend to these best performing devices and geos. And that type of analysis is actually proactively done every few days. So that actually had a good impact on both installs and ad spend. So retargeting, it's also important for what we find is that for the campaign managers to be really involved in tracking performance, especially when you don't necessarily have as much information about your target audience to begin with. So, speaking of audiences, as you saw on the previous slide, we do retargeting, and you don't necessarily need to have a different set of audiences to run a successful retargeting campaign. But here is an example where I want to show where it actually can be incredibly successful, and I really want to encourage any developers on this call to think about sharing as much data as possible with your marketing partners, because it's really a way for everyone to kickstart the success of a campaign. So in this case, our customer here was able to share with us at the start of an overall retargeting effort, the retargeting users broken out into different banded segments based around their historical levels of spend. And this actually brings up sort of a good question. When thinking about retargeting, at the easiest, you look to retarget everyone who's previously been active, or some might want to focus essentially on those high value users, people have spent the most historically. But if you're looking to really think about balancing scale and performance, also think about all those users who are potentially making up the bulk of your retargeting list, but weren't necessarily the highest revenue drivers on a per user perspective. So here, what this actually allowed us to do to understand who these high revenue generating users were, we were able to very aggressively target them wherever possible, trying to acquire them, and if that meant at a much higher cost, we did so. And these people still continue to drive a lot of spend once they were re-engaged. But we would have never actually gotten to scale if you wouldn't have also focused on the lower spend levels. Just because they haven't historically spent as much, these are still really valuable potential users. It just meant that from a strategy perspective, we needed to be a lot more efficient in reactivating them. And in terms of efficiency here, it was the amount of cost that it took to reactivate these users. So by not just focusing on sort of the high value users, we're actually able to drive from a scale perspective a lot of reinstalls, and we were able to balance that with a really positive return on ad spend. So so that was really those are just three snapshots of some of the campaigns that we've done this past year around retargeting. Generally, in each one I talked a little bit about hands-on campaign management, about the power of creatives or audiences. In reality, all of those things are actually taken into account for every single campaign. We don't look at creatives or audiences or hands-on campaign management sort of as like unique tactics for each campaign. They're all taken in totality, but hopefully this was useful in sort of sharing the value by focusing on them can bring to your retargeting campaigns. All of them are important, but I think today I really like to focus, we've really talked a lot about audiences, which actually I think is a great fit because I'm really excited to turn the presentation over to Eduardo, who can share a little bit about Adjust's Audience Builder product. So thank you, Eduardo. Excited to hear more about Audience Builder.
Awesome. Thank you so much for diving deep into that and sharing some of the case studies, Nicole. And following up on some of her points, some people may still be thinking, I understand it's important, but just how important is segmentation in particular, and how much can it really help? Well, a recent study showed that about 94 or up to 94% of marketers have seen an increase of various key metrics by employing personalization. And this could be done via user segmentation, and when combined with engagement tools or practices that Nicole mentioned, which they actively provided Aarki, it can have a large impact on your ROI. So by segmenting your users, your existing users, and understanding behavioral patterns, you're able to reach them in the right moment. So not just days after you've collected and analyzed the data, which may already be too late. So some of the benefits of segmentation will include improving your CRM and CR because campaigns are targeted and relevant. You can create tailored marketing campaigns that meet the needs of various audiences. And you can also reduce server costs on both ends since there are less callbacks involved in order to push user data back and forth. So some of the use cases here at Adjust when it comes to user segmentation is we generally identify 4 broad scenarios when utilizing Audience Builder. And those tend to be usually a combination of cross-promoting your multiple apps, especially if you have a vast app portfolio, retargeting your users, running push campaigns to engage with users directly via personalized messages, and creating lookalike audiences for user acquisition, which you can use in Facebook and Twitter. So some of the use cases when segmenting lists can vary. However, one of the greatest ways to start is when you're creating exclusion lists, if your goal is to target and acquire new users without targeting existing users. So you want to make sure that you're really being aggressive with your ad spend, but understanding that you're spending this wisely. So to do so, you would exclude all of your app users and to prevent new networks from targeting your existing users. Another way to segment your users is to focus on your dormant VIP users, some of the big spenders. So if your goal is to bring back dormant users back in the app and get them to make new purchases, you can run re-engagement campaigns and or targeted push messages simply by defining some of the different conditions that you're looking for specifically within the dashboard. In addition, if you have users that have an intent to purchase but just necessarily haven't pulled the trigger, you can also set some of the conditions just as so. If your goal is to convert users that show that they have this intent and you want to get them back to really finalize the purchase, you could target via re-engagement ads or push campaigns to remind these users that they do have items in the cart and all they have to do is finish the process. You can also target your active VIP users. So if you want to acquire new high-value users who will engage with the app, you can leverage Facebook's value-based lookalike targeting, or you can also deliver rewards via targeted push or re-engagement campaigns. In addition, if you have inactive users and your goal is to convert these users to get back in the app and complete maybe a necessary step in your app, such as registering, you can also target these users with another re-engagement ad to entice them to come back to the app and continue moving down the funnel. In addition, you can also target some of the users who like promotions. So if you see that users tend to convert pretty well only when they're provided with a promo, and this is something that you'd like to move forward with, you can also target these specific users to increase engagement. All right, so just before we jump into the tutorial in how you would set these audiences up within Adjust, I wanted to highlight a few additional features of the tool. So with Audience Builder in Adjust, you can receive the advertising IDs and push tokens of your users directly in the dashboard. You can easily run A/B targeting and control groups by doing so. You can also segment your groups, and your groups will always be completely unique, which means that there will never be an overlap with users. Your audiences are also updated automatically based on the latest user's activity, so the data is always fresh. It'll never go stale. It's always once a user has fallen through the conditions and maybe they just converted within minutes, that would then be pushed to the list. With this, you're also able to share only the data that you feel is necessary for targeting specific user groups to each network. So if you feel like one of your networks is really strong in a certain type of category, you can also share only data that you feel would be best utilized for them. So now jumping into the dashboard, to start, you would actually just click New Audience in the top left corner to create a new audience. From here, you would need to do the following. You would need to enter the name of the audience, select the store, and then select the ADID or push tokens in which you would like to engage with your users. Next, you would then select which app or apps you'd like to include in this audience. We provide complete flexibility. So if you wanted to create a targeted user list that have multiple apps and get them re-engaged, you can also do so. Once completed, You can then select from multiple conditions that we have. So some of these conditions are the apps, the trackers, the countries, device types, install times, the last session, how they were attributed, so if they were organic or non-organic, any revenue events that they've triggered, total time spent, and total revenue. And what's great about Audience Builder is that there's no limit to the amount of conditions to set when creating an audience. So when creating an audience, you can make it as broad as you like, such as when you're creating exclusion lists. So if you wanted to target only brand new users and make sure that that would be 100% efficient in your spend, you can do so. Or you can really hyper target and focus on the users that have only spent so much, have been active within the last X amount of hours or days. And this really gives you the flexibility to ensure that you're targeting the specific type of users that you want to engage in. So here in the dropdown below the total revenue that you see on the left, you'll see that more than is selected. The options in this dropdown are what we call expressions. So expressions are the parameters of conditions, which would include more than, fewer than, less than, exclude, or include. So in this example that we have here, what we'll do is target users that have spent more than 50 euro and triggered a session less than a week ago. So here we're really looking for the big spender users that just haven't been too active lately. In addition, let's also target our audience further. Let's also look for users that have added items to their cart but haven't yet completed the purchase. So I've actually just entered that right there on the left, and that'll include add to cart. So now that we've defined our audience, I can separate my user list into groups. What this allows me to do is segment my audience, or excuse me, segment my users and provide a unique list of users. And you might be asking yourself, why would I do this? Well, there's quite a few reasons why. And some of them would be to A/B test campaigns, if you wanted to analyze network performance across multiple partners that you're working with, or simply just to avoid paying multiple networks to target the same users. You can also create up to 10 groups, and no user will ever be included in more than one group. So remember that groups are dynamic. So this means that new users will be included in the audience list once they apply to the conditions that you've set. Once you've saved the amount of groups you'd like to create, each group will then generate a dynamic URL. So each URL directs to a CSV file containing info on all of the users within that group. The URL, like the audiences and groups that you have, is dynamic. So every time you or a partner downloads the CSV from the URL, it will automatically contain the most up-to-date user lists available. And just as another reminder, no user data will ever overlap between groups. What you also see below is each of the conditions defined for this audience. So it's just a quick way to double check to see what specific audience I've segmented here, the groups that I have available, and each of the segments in detail. And there you have it. So this is Audience Builder, and it's really a powerful tool for your A/B testing and retargeting strategies as we give you the data to reach various segmented users at the right time. Thank you so much. I'll let Kevin take it from here.
All right, thanks Eduardo. Thank you, Nicole, as well. I hope this was really helpful for all our attendees today, and that getting these insights and real life examples allowed you all to relate even better to today's topic and how applicable this is to your own mobile gaming app retargeting strategy. Now is the time we switch over to Q&A session. We don't have a lot of time, but feel free to ask any questions you might have. And we'll answer them as we go. All right, so let's start off. I have a first question in right here, and that one is going to be for Nicole. You talked a little bit about scale. What can Aarki do to increase scale the reactivation numbers?
Sure. Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, Eduardo. So what can we do to increase scale? So I would say probably the main thing is, as I mentioned, really being aggressive with your, one thing that's really important for retargeting is sort of being aggressive in taking advantage of every possible supply source and the potential of every creative unit to reach your audience. What we tend to find is with user acquisition campaigns, there's sort of this learning period. At least when we start campaigns, we try to have a built-in learning period where we try not to run at full scale. With retargeting, actually, right off the bat, because we know who we're targeting, it means that we can go in there much more aggressively. We also know who the user is, so we don't have this sort of learning period to kind of identify, as you would for a new app launch, what the ideal profile is. So, as I said, leveraging supply and creative, but also the audience list is really important in getting that scale, and that's where it's really how we partner with our advertising partners to make sure that we have the best possible user list. That is really important.
Thanks, Nicole. Eduardo, I have two questions coming in regards to the audience builder. The first one is when dividing your user lists in groups, you talked about groups. Do they have to be equally separated? And then if you could follow with the second one that's kind of related, is it possible to actually include users that have certain apps but don't have others?
Great question. So in terms of the separation of apps, that's actually something that has been talked about, and it's something that we're looking forward to. So it is in our product map. So that'll be a great tool, a great addition to our tool that we're looking forward to adding into the platform as well. But in the interim, what you are able to do is run a targeted list as well as an exclusion list, and from there you could actually just cross-check between the device IDs to ensure that you're targeting these specific users. So currently it is possible, but we are looking into adding further features into Audience Builder. In terms of dividing user lists into groups, yeah, that was a great question. And you actually don't have to separate them equally. So you can provide different percentages when creating your groups after you've set your audience. And from there, as long as it equals 100% in total, yeah, you have complete flexibility of how you'd like to separate these groups.
Perfect. Thanks, Eduardo. Nicole, circling back to you, and I think that'll be our last question because we're actually running out of time. What are the most important retargeting segments if we were to run a campaign?
Well, so actually, as Eduardo mentioned, talking about the VIP user, it's really important. Identify your VIP user. Identify that VIP user, and I would say it's really important to actually share that VIP audience list as a separate segment, ideally. The other thing to think about is, not all users who are no longer active are going to be created equally. So essentially, don't send all users. Don't send us users who have not made a purchase or who have made a very low purchase. It's not going to be cost. In terms of being effective with the dollar spent on retargeting, it's better to only send users who have either reached a spend threshold or an activity threshold. So I would say just be smart with the audience segments that you're sending. As I mentioned, though, before, your VIP users are great, but if you also want to you do want to sort of blend that in with users who have spent or have had some activity that's you want to have them repeat, because you're not necessarily going to reach scale with only targeting your VIP users. But essentially, don't send non-spenders if you're interested in driving purchases. Or if you're interested in driving people to explore, new levels, potentially those users who have not gotten to a certain level would not be valuable for you to retarget. We'd be much better off allowing someone like us to spend our time and effort reaching the users who are going to bring you the most potential return.
Great answer. Thank you, Nicole. I'm going to end the webinar here. Thank you both very much for these actionable insights, which are hopefully going to be useful for all of our attendees today. If we did not get to your question, we will make sure to reach out right after this webinar via email. Once again, I'd like to thank our co-presenters, Nicole and Eduardo, for their hard work and time, and obviously a big thank you to all of you guys for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed this as much as we did, and we will see you all next time. Goodbye.